Bound by desire. Blair wiped her hands on her threadbare apron, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and dread, as the rowdy laughter of the tavern patrons filled the air. The smoky room, thick with the stench of stale ale and sweat, seemed to press down on her, a suffocating reminder of her reality. Her arms ached from carrying heavy trays all evening, and her fingers throbbed from countless burns and scrapes, marks of a life she never chose. Every clatter of a mug or barked order sent a spike of anxiety through her. It was just another long, grueling night at her uncle's tavern, a place that had become both her prison and her battleground. Since her parents' untimely deaths, Uncle Bram's bitter words and heavy fists had been a constant shadow in her life, shaping her existence into one of survival rather than living. "Can't you do anything right, you worthless brat?" Uncle Bram's voice bellowed, slicing through the din of the tavern. Blair flinched as he stormed toward her, his face twisted in anger. "You spilled ale on that man's coat. Do you know how much trouble you've caused?" "I'm sorry," she murmured, keeping her eyes cast down, knowing better than to meet his gaze. "Sorry doesn't fix it," he spat, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. "If you weren't my blood, I'd have thrown you out on the street years ago. You're nothing but a burden." The sting of his words hit harder than the grip of his hand, but Blair forced herself to remain silent, her nails digging into her palms. It was the only way to survive. Yet amidst the misery she had learned to endure, to hide her pain behind a mask of silent resilience. But deep down, a spark of longing remained, a yearning for something more, something beyond the grim walls of the tavern and the suffocating grip of her uncle's cruelty. As she moved between tables serving the regulars, her attention snagged on the group that had just entered. 5 men, their presence commanding and magnetic, strode in like they owned the very air they breathed. They exuded an aura of confidence and danger that silenced even the rowdiest patrons. Their cloaks were tailored from the finest materials, draping effortlessly over broad shoulders, and their boots gleamed as though untouched by the filth of the world. Blair's gaze darted over them, lingering on their chiseled features, sharp jaws, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to pierce through the smoky haze of the tavern. Each one was striking, yet her attention locked onto one in particular. He was mesmerizing. His black hair, sleek and perfectly tousled, framed a face that looked as though it had been sculpted by the gods themselves. His piercing silver-gray eyes glowed faintly, holding a depth that seemed to whisper secrets of another world. His every move was fluid and deliberate, radiating a masculinity that both intimidated and intrigued her. It was as though he carried the weight of centuries with him, his presence alone drawing her like a moth to a flame. He was striking. His black hair gleamed under the dim light, and his piercing silver-gray eyes seemed to glow in the smoky haze. There was an aura about him, one that made her both nervous and inexplicably drawn. As she carried a tray to a nearby table, she felt his gaze on her, searing and intense. Her cheeks flushed as she met his eyes, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to fade away. The man smiled, a slight curve of his lips that sent a shiver down her spine and left her skin tingling. Her breath hitched as a strange warmth blossomed in her chest, spreading down to her fingertips. Blair quickly looked away, her heart racing in a rhythm that echoed in her ears. She didn't dare glance his way again, but her body betrayed her, a subtle heat pooling in her stomach as she felt his eyes following her every move. When she stole a glance later, he was still watching, his gaze unreadable but magnetic, pulling her in like a forbidden temptation. She forgot how to breathe. That night after the group left, Blair lay in her tiny room in the attic, unable to banish him from her thoughts. His eyes haunted her dreams, dreams that grew vivid and intense as the days turned into weeks. In her dreams, he was close, impossibly close, his lips brushing hers, his hands leaving a trail of fire wherever they touched. She would wake up breathless, her cheeks burning. 2 years passed, and Blair's life in the tavern remained unchanged. The dreams persisted, and she often wondered if she had imagined the connection she had felt that night. Still, she couldn't forget him. The memory of his eyes, the curve of his lips, was etched into her soul. One evening, as she was scrubbing the floor of the dimly lit tavern, the door creaked open, and a chill ran down her spine. The room fell eerily silent as she looked up to see him. He was back. The same commanding presence, the same piercing eyes, but now there was something darker, something that sent a thrill of both fear and excitement through her. Blair froze, her hands gripping the soapy rag. He walked in, his eyes locking onto hers immediately. She felt exposed, as if he could see every thought, every dream she had ever had about him. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile, and her heart threatened to leap out of her chest. He stayed until the tavern emptied, nursing a drink and watching her with unwavering intensity. As she began to clean up for the night, he rose and disappeared into the shadows. Relieved and disappointed, she finished her tasks and stepped into the storeroom to put away the last of the dishes. "Blair," a deep voice said from the darkness. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. He was there, leaning against the wall, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, stepping closer. "I've waited a long time to see you again." Her back pressed against the shelves as he approached. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt a strange pull, a need to hear what he had to say. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "My name is Iru," he said, his voice a smooth caress. "And you? You have haunted my thoughts for years. I left that night, but I could never forget you." Blair stared at him, her mind reeling. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why me?" Iru hesitated, his expression softening. "Because you're mine," he said simply. "I knew at the moment I saw you, but you were so young, and I had to wait until you were ready." "Ready for what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darkened, and for a moment she saw a flash of something primal in his eyes. "Ready to be mine." The word sent a jolt through her, equal parts fear and exhilaration. Her pulse raced as he stepped even closer, his hand brushing her cheek. His touch was cool, but it sent a warmth spreading through her. I don't understand," she stammered. Iru sighed, his hand dropping to his side. "There's much you don't know about me, Blair. I'm not like other men." She frowned, confusion mingling with the fluttering in her chest. "What do you mean?" His eyes met hers, and she saw the conflict in them. "Finally," he said, "I'm a vampire." The word hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Blair stared at him for a moment before a laugh burst from her lips, light and incredulous. She covered her mouth quickly, her eyes wide with a mix of amusement and disbelief. "A vampire?" she said, still chuckling. "You can't be serious. That's ridiculous." But as her laughter faded, her gaze locked onto his. The humor drained from her face as she took in the unwavering intensity of his silver-gray eyes. There was no trace of a joke, no sign of a smile. He was completely serious, and the realization hit her like a cold wind. Her breath caught and she swallowed hard. "Wait, you're not joking, are you?" "A vampire?" she repeated. Iru nodded. "I know it's a lot to take in, but it's the truth, and it's why I've stayed away, why I've waited. I wouldn't take you from the life you knew until you were ready to make that choice yourself." Blair's heart pounded in her chest as she took in his words. Part of her wanted to run, to escape this man who claimed to be something out of a nightmare, but another part, the part that had been dreaming of him for years, refused to let go of the connection she felt. Why now? she asked. Iru stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. Because I couldn't stay away any longer, he admitted. You've been in my dreams, Blair, just as I've been in yours. The pull between us is undeniable. You feel it, don't you? She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She did feel it. She had felt it since the moment she first saw him. But the fear, the uncertainty, still lingered. After all, who was she to deserve anything more? She was nothing but a slave, a pawn to her uncle's cruel whims, bound to the tavern and the misery it represented. The idea that someone, anyone, let alone someone like him, would see her as more felt impossible, like a cruel joke waiting to unravel. What happens now? She whispered, her voice trembling with doubt. Iru smiled, his fangs glinting faintly in the dim light. That's up to you, he said gently, as if sensing the weight of her thoughts. I won't force you into anything, but if you choose to come with me, I promise you'll never have to suffer here again. You'll be free. Blair's mind whirled. Could she trust him? Could she leave everything she had ever known behind for a chance at something more? As she looked into his eyes, she saw sincerity, longing, and something else, a promise of a life beyond the misery she had endured. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. I want to go with you, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Iru's smile widened and he reached out, taking her hand in his. You won't regret this, he said. As they left the tavern behind, Iru's grip on her hand tightened slightly, reassuring, yet firm. Within moments, the world blurred around her, the dark streets of the village disappearing in a haze. Blair gasped as her surroundings shifted, the cold, grimy air of the tavern replaced by warmth and an otherworldly stillness. She found herself standing in a bedroom so exquisite it stole her breath. The walls were clad in rich black stone, polished to a sheen that reflected the flickering light of a roaring fireplace. Above her, a grand chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its golden arms adorned with countless crystals that sparkled like captured starlight. Heavy drapes of deep velvet framed tall windows, and a massive, canopied bed sat at the center, its black frame gilded with delicate gold filigree that shimmered in the firelight. On either side of the bed stood ornate candle holders, their golden surfaces catching the warm glow of flickering flames. Everything about the room was regal, mysterious, and intoxicating, like stepping into a dream with edges of darkness. Blair turned slowly, taking it all in, her heart pounding. Where are we? She whispered, her voice trembling with awe. This is my home, Iru said, his voice low and soothing. A place where you'll never be hurt again. She turned to face him, the firelight casting his sharp features in a golden glow. It's beautiful, she admitted, though her uncertainty lingered. But why bring me here? Iru stepped closer, his intense gaze softening as he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Because this is where you belong, Blair. Not in that tavern, not under his cruelty. Here, with me. Free, safe, cherished and above quotation mark. Loved. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his tone, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something more. Something extraordinary. Iru's hand lingered on hers before he stepped back and clapped his hands softly. The sound echoed in the grand room, and within moments 2 figures entered, women clad in shimmering robes, their expressions warm yet deferential. They will take care of you, Iru said, his voice tender. You deserve to feel your best, Blair. She hesitated, glancing between him and the 2 maids, but their gentle smiles eased her nerves. They guided her to an adjoining chamber, where the air was fragrant with lavender and steam curled from a marble bath large enough to be a pool. Gold fixtures gleamed in the candlelight, and the water shimmered with hints of magic. The maids worked in perfect harmony, their hands skilled as they cleansed away the grime and weariness of her old life. One used fragrant oils, her touch soothing and rejuvenating, while the other whispered soft incantations that seemed to flow through Blair's body like a warm current. Her bruises faded, her skin glowed, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. Tears pricked her eyes as she looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror. A young woman who looked healthy, vibrant, and alive stared back. When they were finished, the maids dressed her in a gown of deep black silk that clung to her figure and shimmered like liquid oil in the firelight. Her hair was finally clean and brushed until it shone, cascading in waves down her back. "He's waiting for you," one of the maids said with a soft smile, gesturing to the door. Blair stepped into the dining hall, her breath catching at the sight. The room was bathed in the golden glow of hundreds of candles. A table, adorned with fine linens and crystal glasses, stood near a tall window overlooking a moonlit garden. The atmosphere was intimate and enchanting, the kind of setting she had only ever read about in fairy tales. Iru stood at the far end of the table, his gaze locking onto hers the moment she entered. His sharp features softened, and he crossed the room to meet her halfway. He took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "You're breathtaking," he murmured, his silver-gray eyes holding hers. "But it's not just your beauty, Blair. It's you. Everything about you, but mainly your eyes, the way you look at me." Her cheeks flushed, and she couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, she let him guide her to the table, where they sat close, the flickering candlelight casting golden shadows on their faces. They talked, their voices low and intimate, and Blair felt as though she had stepped into another world, one where she was cherished and safe. As the meal ended, Iru reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken emotion. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his eyes searching hers for permission. Blair's breath hitched, and she nodded, her heart pounding. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet consuming, a perfect blend of passion and reverence. Time seemed to stop as the warmth of his touch enveloped her, chasing away every shadow of her past. She felt the weight of 2 years, years spent dreaming of him, yearning for his return, wondering if he had forgotten her, lift from her heart. And she saw in his eyes the same longing, the torment of waiting and wanting. In that moment, Blair knew she had found something extraordinary, a future worth believing in, forged through the fire of their mutual desire and the years they had spent apart, dreaming of this very moment.